thank you so much for the introduction. Piero asked me to moderate here on the spot, so we'll see how this goes. I'll try my best to keep the conversation going and lively. I think we should start with a round of introductions, first and foremost, and then we have a bit of an agenda to get into and ask some questions of each of the panelists here within VR, AR, MR, and that type of space. If each one of you maybe would like to do a short introduction, or should we start with David maybe first and talk about Buckminster Fuller?
Do introductions.
Okay, we'll do introductions first, and then we'll get into the Buckminster Fuller stuff. So, yeah. Who would like to start? Meredith, would you like to start? No.
I'll go ahead and do it. I don't mind making a fool out of myself. Hi, Mark Stephen Meadows, and I think if I move this, I understand that it will. The other one. Let's see. Huh? Sorry, Piero. This is what we get for letting me touch the technology and go first, right? No, I'm not making it down.
Yes.
There we are. There, thank you. So, we design personalities. Basically what we do is we consider them to be something that is a form and a function both. And in bots, across the landscape, we see that there are chat bots, which are things that use words and text. We have assistants, in which there's a voice interface, there's a text-to-speech component, a voice recognition component, and then our real sweet spot at Botanic are conversational avatars. So we're like, let's take chatbots and animate polygons with them. So really what we've done for the last 15 years is sort of develop a sort of a system by which you speak to this little character and it speaks back. We try to give them personalities. We try to work with archetypes. We try to let people know what the value of the experience is and how to control it. And using archetypes and personality, we can kind of indicate what sector of the service industry this thing might come from, for example. You find these archetypes all over the place. So we try to embed them in the avatars that we build, not only in the ways that they speak, but also in how they look. Here's some examples. And this is more or less over the last like 2 years. It takes us about a year to build one full system, because you have to kind of write a book, really, and to have a whole conversational system. Along the bottom, we start with the sketches, and we are a group of poets and award-winning authors. I'm a painter, and I'm pleased to be here. Thank you. Oh yeah, we have some products too. All right, go ahead.
Thanks. I have some questions about that. I look forward to getting into that. My background is primarily in the utilization of immersive environments to expand perceptions. I work a lot with data visualizations, primarily planetary systems, working with collaborations with a number of different scientists from different disciplines to understand how we can utilize visualizations to really help us to perceive what someone earlier referred to as making the invisible visible, but to really get a sense of how it is that we are imagining essentially our place in the cosmos, but the functioning of our planetary system, and really trying to utilize visualizations effectively to transcend disciplines and to start conversations across many different disciplines so that we can understand the complexity of a lot of the interactions and the interconnections of the planet. To do that, I started a company almost 15 years ago, co-founded it to make portable immersive environments. We were frustrated in the 1990s with the limitations of head-mounted displays in virtual reality. We really wanted to create some more social environments, and so we created some technologies with custom optics and mostly spherical projection systems, unlike the caves, to explore interactive real-time sort of powers of 10 zooming visualization platforms to allow us to sort of aggregate a lot of different scientific data. That led to a little bit what I'll be talking about later about Buckminster Fuller's work and the relevance of what he was doing to how it is we could be thinking about the utilization of this resurgence of virtual reality technologies now and head-mounted displays and AR and everything else.
My name's Meredith Drum, again, just gonna look at my notes. So I'm interested in using mobile augmented reality to make public art projects that spark critical dialogue about a site or a situation, but also that engage the experience of the user in ways that the mobile device usually negates. So about 5 years ago, I started a project called Oyster City, and it uses a place-based AR platform designed by Phoenix Taves, who lives in Santa Cruz. And I also work with another artist, Rachel Stevens, and Rachel and I are kind of the artists, even though I also do some of the technology. But the piece it invites players to explore ecological and social histories within the context of the long relationship between oysters and humans in New York Harbor. It also invites people to think about the use of oyster reefs as bioremediation and as potential blocks for waves that might flood lower Manhattan. So the locative media is activated as players move across a particular terrain in lower Manhattan, and actually it's on an island, it's a public park. And as the documentary elements are revealed, the game also keeps pointing the player back to her body and her senses as she explores the waterway. And that's important to me, this idea of pointing back or bringing back to the sensual, no matter what the particular subject matter that this game is exploring, because I am worried about the loss of that sensual engagement, physical engagement. I'm a fan of Mackenzie Wart's writing, and I particularly enjoy his book from 2012, Telesthesia, Communication, Culture, and Class, published by the New School. And he uses this term telesthesia, which is to perceive things at distance without use of known bodily sense organs, to discuss what's happening with our heavy use of networked culture, the heavy use of network culture to move commodities. So in a post-capitalist age, according to Work, we have entered the era of the vector. Our commodity economy has moved beyond manufacturing into centers on controlling information flow, which the participant or the consumer experience telesthetically, so without any physical sense. So my idea in using augmented reality with my Oyster City project, but with some other work I've made with AR, is to engage the body and make it place-based and somatic, to maybe, however temporarily, release the user from these vectors that push consumer culture. So I can talk more about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so my name is Andrew Blanton, and I am currently the area coordinator for the Digital Media Art program here at San Jose State University. I will be, well, let me just say, I started my studies as a classical percussionist, as a drummer, and that's what I've done for a long period of my life. At some point I got into hybridizing musical instruments with digital worlds and building virtual spaces to create virtual instruments. So that process of building instruments has been a major part of my practice, and I'll be performing another half hour or so, or I guess an hour from now at 4:30, so I'll try and stay as hospitable as possible before then. But with that said, I think I have three major trajectories within my artistic and musical practice, which are the historical precedents, right, of what came before us, the theoretical critical precedents, like why are we doing something, and the technical. Right, so these three have to combine together to create what, for me, is an art practice. So within that trajectory and thinking about how I use technology in my practice and how that augments my practice, I think a lot about the history and what's come before in looking at the processes of instrument design and synthesizer design, right? So if we look back at people who were early on pioneers in visualization, such as Dan Sandine, Phil Morton, Rod Etra, this type of space of people doing work in that type of environments, and how those evolved into maybe cave technologies of the 90s, and then artists who were doing some pioneering work with VR in that space, where they had these huge boxes that would sit on their heads and give you maybe a neck ache, you know? And how that translates into a practice that is alive today, and how we as digital artists work in this space to really think about how we engage with a technology that is incredibly isolating, and how that technology is used to maybe make us feel more human. How do these forms of technology end up, how do we interface with them? So that's the bulk of my practice, and we can get into that more, I think, as the conversation rolls on. But firstly, I'm curious, Piero sort of primed us with this idea of Buckminster Fuller, and I think his Buckminster Fuller is sort of this luminary, this huge figure in this field. And my entrance to Buckminster Fuller was through, I believe, like Gene Youngblood's Expanded Cinema for the forward for that, and
yeah, mine too.
It's
that was the first one.
Yeah, it's sort of a spectacular place to begin, and as well as maybe Radical Software from some of his publications within that. So yeah, if you could please.
Sure. Yeah. Piero asked me to do a summary in 2 minutes of what he's like.
I have the timer going.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I mean, he's an interesting character because his character is so big, it kind of overshadows a lot of the ideas that he was actually generating. So I think it's sometimes more interesting to focus on his ideas than him himself, because a lot of times people kind of know him as the dome guy. But sort of broadly speaking, McLuhan called him the Leonardo da Vinci of the 20th century. He called himself a comprehensive anticipatory design scientist. It's kind of the way that he was able to think about what are all of the things that need to come together with regards to the arts, the sciences, the engineering, kind of the futurist orientation, and being, in particular, comprehensive in thinking. And so he really had a lifelong experiment. And he was a self-taught architect, engineer, poet, sailor, and he really worked very diligently and literally tirelessly, sleeping about 2 hours a day, to document everything he was doing as an experiment. And the fruits of that are actually here at Stanford in a 700-volume archive that he collected from the 1920s until the time of his death in 1983. And I think it's relevant, particularly relevant for this panel, because over the course of this experiment in the 1920s, he began collecting data sets about planetary trends and human needs. And he became very interested in what are the types of artifacts and processes and approaches that we could take to make the world work for 100% of humanity. So he was thinking out many, many decades in advance, anticipating what would we need to do, what would we need to perceive in particular, in order to design a civilization where we're optimizing the utilization of resources in such a way that we weren't just kind of, blowing this good fortune that we have of this incredibly fruitful planet, and foolishly sort of maintaining a particular trajectory that he was very critical of with regards to economics. He was an editor at Fortune for a while, and he was extremely critical of a lot of the externalities of the global capitalist system. And he felt like it was important for us to be able to perceive a lot of things that we simply don't perceive. So one of his particular interests was in how we were using data visualizations and visualization environments to be able to perceive the metabolism of the planet, to think about all of the planetary flows, whether that be economic or whether that be atmospheric or hydrological or migration patterns, so that we could begin to utilize our own pattern recognition capabilities to start to think about the kind of the nested scales of the systems on the planet. And in the last panel, there was a slide up about World Game, which was sort of his framing of the ways in which these technologies could be developed to really encourage mass participation in a game whereby everyone was trying to make the world work for 100% of humanity. If you saw Arrival, it was the idea of I'm going to spoiler alert, but it was the idea of the aliens telling the humans, like, you better get your non-zero sum game figured out, because all of our games are usually zero sum. It's, me or you, win or lose. And so the visions that he had for the use of technologies really way predated the capacities that they had at the time. He was proposing in the 1960s for the US Pavilion in Montreal in particular to do a massive sphere which they built, a 250-foot diameter geodesic dome, but he wanted to line it with light bulbs and supercomputers and have people come in and play this world game, to have all these real-time data feeds so that they could be figuring out, kind of gaming the system, kind of the opposite of war games, to have a world game, a world peace game as he originally called it, to understand, is there anything, like, and what can be done to optimize the utilization of resources. And specific to where we are now, I mean, everything I'm saying, it's probably pretty obvious. We have the tools now, we have all of the satellite data, we have very, very ready access to a lot of the open databases, the visualization tools, the gaming engines. And one of the aspects of the use of these tools that he was constantly pointing out was that our conceptions of the world and of reality are very, very structured by our direct experience. And he was absolutely adamant of the importance of direct experience, and particularly within experiential learning, and that we develop our technologies so that we can perceive things beyond what it is that we can normally perceive in sort of our natural mediation, but to have sort of sensory prosthetics whereby we could kind of re-architect our perception and our sensory devices so that we can begin to really have a direct experience of things that we normally can't perceive. And I think that's where I was discussing with Piero in the context of this panel. You know, what are the implications of that kind of thought for how we're using VR and AR? It's pretty clear in the terms of a lot of artworks that people are creating that that's a real interest. But where are we going with that, and how can we be thinking about the use of these tools for understanding these complex interconnections of these different systems, and how can we become, well, for a very tangible example, how can we become aware of just simply the limitations of our visual system, you know, that we see in this very limited spectrum, the sort of band of the electromagnetic spectrum. But there's all this other stuff happening, and so for an example, if we could see carbon dioxide, it'd be a very different conversation about carbon dioxide. It's just that when these things are invisible, they tend to be able to, we can push them out of our consciousness more. So I'm curious to hear from the other panelists sort of ideas around sort of what do you would envision with regards to some of these tools and technologies of ways that we could be expanding perception.
Well, I think that's great, and I would like to sort of open it up to both Mark and Meredith, because I think it's a really interesting space. Each one of you guys have, you know, if you're working with avatars and sort of how that, like, humanist elements come in, or if you're working with augmented reality too, those are both spaces that were sort of just addressed. Do either one of you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, try to line these together. Yeah, I think y'all are probably familiar with Pokemon Go, right? Anyone not heard of it? So what was weird about this, and in regards to like being able to see carbon dioxide and what avatars are, and can we identify with our bodies while we're out in these virtual worlds, and what the hell is a polygon anyway? Well, I downloaded, or I started to, Pokemon Go, and I find out that this app is asking me for OAuth level authentication on my phone. So I'm like, who needs to be able to send emails from my phone because I want to go and look at Pokemon, right? Well, I go and I look it up, and I'm like, okay, Niantic is the company that's making Pokemon. Who's Niantic? And Google happens to have like a 60% ownership in Niantic. So then I get really interested, and I'm like, why is Google putting Pokemon around out there? And so what it turns out is that they managed to make a system by which everyone goes, they wave their cameras, and they collect data for this thing called Project Tango. Project Tango is a big 3D data set, and basically Google needed to have these particular areas sort of polished up. So they got all of us to run around and go hunt Pokemon. Now, that's a way we could do something like, well, sure, we can build 3D data sets so that robots can run through there, but it'd be cool if we could also do things like see, you know, carbon emissions, or be able to understand the history of oysters. And it seems like there are these ways, whether we're using blockchain or not, that we can actually get people to coordinate, you know, perhaps not so surreptitiously, but to do some really good things for the future of the world. I mean, augmented reality and virtual reality, I mean, yeah, I'll put a cork in it there, but that seems like there are a lot of potentials in front of us with these techs, right?
And so, Meredith, what do you think? How do you think your work intervenes into that space?
I mean, I think it doesn't intervene so much as it just positions an alternative, because I'm pretty skeptical about any of this at the moment, because it's pretty much all controlled by corporations that are just concerned with their bottom line, essentially. And I feel pretty frustrated in using augmented reality at the moment the way that I was using it, which was through the mobile device, because I have no control over over those devices, and they're really Apple and Google and the other companies that control them really limit how we as creators can shape those apps. It's just such a boxed-in view, and so so I think one of the things that I'm interested in is what the difference between how the web rolled out and how these mobile techs are rolling out, which are much more controlled by corporations and don't have the freedom to exist independently of a particular, kind of product made by a company. So I don't really know if I have that much hope that that the technologies that are at the moment with augmented reality and virtual reality have any positive outcome. And so I think I'm just interested in disrupting them at the moment and seeing if we can just use them otherwise, even just for a few moments. Because in a lot of ways, I think those are the only breaks that we get. They're fairly brief.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated space to be in right now. I mean, I'm always struck going back and reading this, so I'm going to talk about expanded cinema at least anyway, because that was my initial entrance into this space, right? And it feels very utopian, right? In reading those texts from early on, and looking at what the realization of those technologies is now. Here we stand in a the election has been sort of questionable as to whether or not the technology made a strong intervention into that space. And I think that is more on the dystopian side of what is possible with some of these, military level technologies that are now coming to fruition, and as they have interventions into our life. And so that to me becomes a question of, well, how do we as artists begin to intervene in that space and really reappropriate these technologies for something that is more of a human use, and how do we have them intervene into our space?
Yeah, I think that the role of the artist these days is really more as inventor. We can say that, I went to San Francisco Art Institute and I'm a portrait artist, and therefore I build avatars, but I think that ultimately my job is to come up with new ideas. And artists are sort of like these, I guess they're like sensors for society. So it seems as though what we need to do is, certainly this dystopic notion of robotic robots gets me up out of the bed in the morning. I'm terrified at having lots of Siris and Cortanas saying, ask me anything, as it's doing there in the lower left-hand corner, constantly following me around like a herd of little, corporate obedient poodles that are following me through the subconscious world of the mall that I live in augmented reality. I'm like, we gotta design our way out of that, right? So it seems like, as artists, as nerve endings, we respond to something, and then we can invent it. And we may, because artists tend to have this sort of dystopic tendency at times, be able to really say, this is what we need to design our way out of, and invent that stuff. So I say, as artists, let's invent, let's get to work. Let's build corporations to fight the corporations. Let's use technology to subvert technology, and let's not be sentimental. Oh, sorry, one last thing. I read this really interesting article, because everyone's like, oh, VR is going to isolate us, and it's going to keep it all apart, and certainly you can see how we will live in these shambled apartments, and we'll have these head-mounted devices on, and we won't talk. So this really interesting article from San Francisco said there's this new technology, and it's going to keep people away from each other. They'll never sit down and talk. Personal conversation will go away, friendships will disintegrate, families will disintegrate, and the article came from 1920s, San Francisco with the telephone. Yeah, exactly. Now we see today, telephone's a layer, right? Books are a layer. Virtual reality is a layer. The sedimentary foundation we stand on, we should just continue to build on top of, and not get sentimental about it, but try to fix it and respond to that stuff. That's my long-winded answer.
Fuller had something to say about that with regards to something along the lines of, we're going to make all the right tools for all the wrong reasons, but the tools will be there. So the idea that these infrastructures get developed, you know, billions and trillions of dollars that go into these networks and into these observation systems and into these display systems, and you know, and I think the question for artists in particular is like, how do we think about those infrastructures and the utilization of those tools in just a completely different way? Because so much of the problem that we have stems from the way that we're thinking. I mean, quite literally, the paradigms that we're in, and how it is that we're justifying particular systems by ignoring all the consequences of those systems that are becoming so explicit. Like it's getting more and more difficult to ignore the consequences of what's going on. And I think in particular with a lot of the existential threat that's coming because of automation, you know, we're actually going to be forced to completely rethink the nature of work and the nature of jobs and the nature of economies. And one of the books that he wrote in 1962, based on a lecture he gave in 61, was called Education Automation, where he basically was suggesting, and this was kind of a theme back in the 50s and 60s, that a lot of people saw automation coming as a major disruptive force, which it's interesting, it took over 50 years for that to become very tangible in some ways. But he was asking the question, what does education look like in the age of automation, when we no longer had to have jobs that could be done much better by machines and different types of computing systems? And what is that? I mean, what's the function of humans? What are we doing here? What do we have that's unique? And he essentially predicted that there would be two-way interactive networks that would allow us to video record like the best professors around and the best carriers of knowledge that you could order on demand and be able to watch those whenever you want to, that we would have different types of geospatial visualization tools to be able to visualize all these types of things, all these different types of metabolic flows on the planet. So it's a very interesting read to go back and see where he was saying what those important capabilities and capacities would be within education. And I think that that's a conversation we need to have pretty quickly in terms of really facing up to the fact that a lot of these studies that are coming out are saying that up to 50% of the jobs are going to go away. And this is probably within the next 10 or 20 years, if not sooner. So with regards to how we're even thinking about the context in a sort of non-utopian way, or I don't know, I think dystopian, utopia, it's not mutually exclusive. It's all happening all the time. But what do we want to be teaching? What do we need to be doing? What's the unique capacity of human beings in an age when we've got rapidly accelerating machine cognition that could potentially really be used to benefit us, to grapple with complexity and to understand systems and to do things like analyze satellite data? It's already happening. They're catching illegal fishing boats in the ocean because they're using machine intelligence to analyze the sat data that's being gathered every single day. And there's a lot of really interesting potential there, but it would, I think, particularly from an artist perspective, like how can we look at all of this differently in a way that is allowing us to really collaborate with these other forms of cognition, as opposed to being kind of freaked out by the fact that they're going to take over the world.
Meredith, what do you think about this whole space? I mean, do you want to follow up on that?
Sure. I mean, I really admire Bucky Fuller quite a lot, but I think with my own work, I tend to think small. So I've thought about small sites and situations that I can get my head around and that I might be able to be of some use to. And then for the most part, I've attempted to do that with sites and situations that I know fairly well, because I have a fear of kind of thinking that I know what's good for us, and trying to define what us is can be really tricky. So instead of thinking kind of like of planet Earth, a spaceship Earth, which again I really admire, but I'm not so sure that I want to try to forecast or build for everyone, because I think that's just ethically problematic. So, I think within, a smaller situation, I can think in terms of collaborating with the techniques and the technologies that are present, and the human and non-human life, and how we can come together to kind of create unique and maybe helpful things happen, but thinking larger than that, I just can't do it. So I'm wondering if other people, how you approach the panel, that the ethical issue of like, projecting out what's good onto masses of people.
We've got this weird thing that like AI, there's lots of different kinds of AI, but in terms of, for example, natural language processing or voice recognition systems, they're basically built on libraries, like with machine learning. You need libraries, you need really big libraries, and you need a lot of them for the system to work, and those libraries are built by people, and those people have all these prejudices and kind of quirky ways of thinking that seem to be localized, and so that particular system that's being driven by a particular knowledge base was really authored by these individuals. And when it was like, I don't know, a number of years ago, like 12 years ago, we had built a couple of chatbots, and we made a copy of the other one and began to kind of talk to each other. And the conversation quickly boiled down to Catherine Zeta-Jones and pizza. And we're like, this isn't really what our subconscious is it? And we're like, yeah. And so what we found, like for Epidemic, our tagline is building humane machines. Because for us, you look at AI, these systems like Ask Me Anything, like a bot that's supposed to be able to talk with anyone at any time about anything is destined to fail. It's a fool's errand. So what we do to try to address that is we say, who's the individual user? How do we build something for that particular group? How do we then make the libraries that are appropriate that reflect the values of that end user? So that then hopefully we can make something that's automated, because we're dealing with automated media, whether it's a conversational system or whether it's real-time 3D. And I think that if we don't take that approach of like, what's the individual relationship that we're building via this technology, then it's just going to be another fool's errand, right? Then we're just like pumping up the technology for no reason. Because it's about our interaction, isn't it?
I mean, is that process all to combat bias within the design process?
Yeah, actually it's to introduce bias, is to look bias sort of in the face and say, this is for these people. Because we do a lot of work with gesture recognition and tone recognition, and like, if someone sounds happy and they use the word happy, but you get weird vectors that can, if I say, I love public speaking, that's not different than I say, I love public speaking. Even though the words are the same, the gestures indicate something else. But in India, they did this bobble. And as a Westerner, our libraries don't recognize that. So we have to trigger that bias, identify the bias, and then have that system recognize that bias, which is, again, usually localized. And if we don't recognize that, then we lose our individuality. We do stop being individuals. We stop being, it's a kind of the quirky things that are different that make each of us valuable.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly from my own art practice anyway. That's one of the spaces that I intervene in, is to think about, how do we have these two simultaneous things, right? We have the modernity on the one hand, and then we have the modernization, right? So we have the actual technology that's being built, and then we have the thoughts and concepts and ideas of how that technology is used. And those, the modernity can be manipulated from culture to culture, and they're not always. It's not always that modernization is interpreted or used in the same ways, if I can position it that way. So I'm looking at the clock and I'm shocked that we somehow managed to run our time down. But we have 5 minutes, and perhaps somebody from the audience would like to ask a question.
Question.
Okay.
So I like when Meredith talked about disrupting virtual reality and so on. And that made me think of when the web came out, when I could build my own website. It took me, what, I don't know, 2 hours to learn how to use HTML and build my own website, and then I started doing things that were not the things that the web was designed for. But with virtual reality, it's much more difficult. The problem is that as a producer of virtual worlds, you need to know so much, you need to have powerful computers. So it's very difficult to disrupt something when you cannot easily buy and use the tool.
Yeah, that's a huge problem, and I try to teach. I'm an educator, and what is important to teach our students, and I think trying to show them that how to make, encourage them to make open systems that can't be kind of closed down by a particular company and controlled. I think we all will grow. I mean, I'm speculating that most people will grow more with an open system than with these locked down phones like that.
I mean, don't you guys think we're still such early days on though in VR as well? So a lot of the formats and the standards are still sort of being standardized, right? I think Steam VR has a big push right now to standardize the way that a lot of VR is built and then interpreted by the various headsets and devices. But that's changing daily, and that's its own sort of technical hurdle.
Allow me to be contentious. Because in the 90s, 95 to 98, we were helping along this thing called VRML, which is these days WebVR, WebGL. And we thought we were doing this whole new thing. It was like, holy cow, this is great. Now, I'm like the guy with the white hair up here, right? So I gotta say I'm 48, so I gotta say, not like you, Piero, but in any case, I've seen a little bit. And we were down at this VR thing about 2 weeks ago, and we're watching the same damn thing we were doing 20 years ago. And it was like, this is new, the web's gonna be 3D. And we're like, no, we were doing this. And then I realized, no, it's Euclid. Euclid was doing this. VR was on the cave paintings in Lusco. That's how old this is. And I think that for us to say it's new is sort of egoistic. I think, and here's what I'm being contentious, right? Let's just rough it up a little bit here. I think that we gotta recognize that we're young, but these ideas and these concepts are ancient. Like the number 2 is ancient, or the number 0 is ancient. And let's look at it with that perspective.
Yeah, and I guess I think I mostly agree with you. Except that I think when we're dealing with a specific technology with protocols and things of this nature, I think we have to look at the history of that, which is sort of unique. And then I would refer to something like the Kittler semi-technical introduction to computer graphics, where it's like he looks at this history of how a lot of the technology we're using is based on military technology, right? And this is why we have these Cartesian coordinate systems versus polar coordinate systems, because a lot of these systems for visualization were built for polar coordinates, so you could like trace trajectories of things flying around the planet if you wanted to for whatever military reason. So I think that has a unique history in and of itself that has to be dealt with somehow. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you on the aesthetics part of things. Yes, I think humans have always wanted the virtual to be actualized somehow, if I could say that. I think that's a major component of it. I guess what I was more specifically speaking to was the technology, of how that technology comes to fruition, right? And that as the technology evolves so rapidly, that technology that we use now and the instantiation of the technology looks a lot different from the way that we did it 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
Okay, since we have 32 seconds,
yeah.
I think we should say a word about the lasers. If you liked what we saw, art, science, technology, there's a series that goes on in many different places, in 3 places in the Bay Area, very soon also in San Jose. It's called Laser, Leonardo, Art, Science, even Iran de Woo. Go to leonardo.info, click on Laser, and you will see the program. It's USF, Stanford, UC Berkeley, Santa Cruz, very soon San Jose State University. And that happens, UC Davis, sorry, there's many more. And it happens almost every month. Okay? You want to close, Anna? Thank you, Anna, for being the MC of the event. Thank you so much.